Now I'm going to get into the meat of some of the guidelines. I've come up with 12 different topics and organized those into 4 groups. They are what the user imagines, what the user does, what the user sees, and what the user needs. By the way, this summary slide is an example of what I mean by hierarchical and structured data. It's an outline in reasonably parallel grammar with descending levels of information in progressively smaller typefaces. It can be simplified even more like this. Structuring data is about stripping away anything that's redundant or unnecessary to expose the variations in the true content. Some people call this the grain, like the grain of wood, which I think is lovely. It's all about looking for patterns. So here's group 1, what the user imagines. Foundation. From beginning to end, user input should drive the design process. That doesn't mean we shouldn't be skeptical and probing. Users don't always know what they want or need. But without their participation, what's the point? Sarah Severson and Matt Odell did great jobs this morning covering foundation and the design process, so I'm not going to go through every step here. But I cannot emphasize enough that the client is at the center of the process. Even if they want you to wave a magic wand to create their software from thin air, don't be tempted. Make them work for it. Every design process is a hard-working collaboration. Make sketches on paper, draft sketches on the computer, build functional models, and put these prototypes in front of a user to see if they can figure out what they're looking at. If they can't, make sure they understand that they're not stupid. The interface just isn't working for them. Your only job at the moment is to watch them try to figure it out. Duct tape your mouth shut if necessary. When you go live, try to separate the roles of developer, admin, and trainer. This helps keep you honest about usability. Line up somebody who's going to help manage the system and enlist business experts as your trainers. If you're in-house, it's in nobody's interest if you wear all the hats. Hats can look good on other people too. Mental model. The user's idea of the solution should match yours. The user has a mental image of the task that they want to perform. If the system conforms to this image, or they don't have to do much adjusting, it'll feel more intuitive to them and they'll learn faster. Their conception of the task will be reshaped by every conversation with you and later by their experience of the solution. So try to understand things from their point of view as early as possible to get an unbiased sense of how users in general might approach the task. As you gather requirements, you'll start to create a mental model as well. It's when you leave the user out of the process that your mental model can drift off into some developer-centered parallel universe, so keep checking in. Metaphors are like menus, the desktop, or the trash can. They aren't physical things, they're the imaginary building blocks of the mental model, representing concepts and features of the solution, concrete and familiar ideas that stand for abstract things. Metaphors allow the user to apply their expectations to the virtual environment, suggesting a usage or experience without necessarily imposing limits on functionality. What's wild is that many of them have become reified in our minds to the point that we've stopped thinking of them as metaphors. It's almost like they're real in themselves. What comes to mind first? When you think of a file, do you think of a bunch of papers in a piece of folded cardboard? Or data stored on your computer? When you think of the dock, do you think of a place to tie up your boat? Or a toolbar that gives easy access to applications and documents? And when you think of a hamburger, gotcha, this icon is really supposed to look like a menu or a list. Oh, by the way, Mike Stern made a great case against hamburger menus in his WWDC presentation this year. My updates will have a link, so feel free to keep thinking of the hamburger as a tasty sandwich. Navigation works best when the user has a clear sense of place. The mental model is your best guide for designing navigation, for constructing that imaginary building that the user will be exploring. And the user is going to need something to orient themselves in that space. Here's group 2, what the user does. Direct manipulation. Interaction should feel effortless. Use cues like color, location, context, and labels to invite the user to interact with your solution. See how Apple's own apps do this. For example, Notes uses a single color to indicate interactive elements, and the breadcrumb in the upper left is just a chevron with the word Notes, nothing more. Make the actual click or tap target at least as big as the visible click or tap target, ideally bigger with a hidden button behind it. For mobile, remember that 44 points is the minimum size. Along the same lines, don't assign new behaviors to built-in UI elements, and don't create custom UI elements to replicate the perfectly good behavior of built-in elements. Here's the next topic in this section, what the user does. Data input. I love this quote. For each request for input, give something useful in return. Matt Odell told me this is the concept of voluntary compliance. A user will perform an action when they can see the benefit it provides, when they can visualize the end results and know how to get there. Think of data entry as a conversation between the user and the solution. There's a lot that we can learn and steal from web interfaces in this area. How many of us became developers because we didn't like inputting data and hated to see other people do it so inefficiently? So make choices clear and intuitive, identify redundant requests for data and remove them, and fill in text when possible. Also, require as little as possible from the user. Perform edit checks as they enter their information. See if you can prevent data input errors rather than giving the user a validation message later. And consider waiting to display required icons until the user finishes entering data. It'll keep your UI cleaner. Finally, put the user in control. Give the user as much control you think is reasonable, considering who they are. What choices will empower them without creating a support nightmare? Account for what level of knowledge they have and what level of damage they can do, but generally, allow them to initiate and control actions, including the opportunity to cancel or stop operations once they start them. Of course, you are deciding which decisions to give to the user, figuring out which ones really matter, because they bring the user closer to their goal. And continuing with what the user does, here's modelessness. Modes often confuse people because the same physical actions have different purposes and results. For example, in FileMaker, browse mode and find mode use the same layouts, but perform completely different functions. In the early days of FileMaker, people would call tech support in tiers because they keyed in hundreds of records in find mode and lost them all. Now there's an alert after the 10th find request, and find mode itself is more visually distinct, but the underlying issue of it being a mode hasn't gone away. If we say that you want to avoid changing modes on the user, then it's a good idea to provide alternatives to find mode. I used to think that if I set up my layouts with all the right fields and made it really clear which ones were available, why couldn't my users just go into find mode? It gives them the most flexibility. But over time, I've come to accept that many people need something simpler, more targeted, like a pop-up window in browse mode with global fields and very clear choices about what they're finding. The new search paradigm is quick find. People are coming to expect it wherever they go, and it works in browse mode. Make it available whenever it's reasonable to do so, being thoughtful about which fields are enabled for the search. I don't recommend using unsorted calculations, related fields, or at least be sure to test them for performance issues. As well as avoiding modal changes, try to limit your use of modal dialogues. When I say modal dialogues, I'm talking about two different things here. Old-fashioned custom dialogues like this, which are easy to set up but not very user-friendly, you can't control how big or small they are. The user does this. There's no indication to the user if your text is overflowed, and the options for data input are limited. Then there are advanced-style dialog windows that became possible in FileMaker 12. These take more work to set up, but their flexibility supports a much better user experience. You dedicate a special layout to the window and can do anything with it that you like. Come to think of it, the window that you use to specify advanced style options is in fact itself a modal window. Go figure. The important thing about both the old-fashioned custom dialog and the newfangled advanced window is that the user can only interact with this window and nothing else until the window is closed. Dave Dumas says, "When I use a modal dialog, I feel like I'm saying, look, I didn't have time to program this correctly, so we're going to stop everything to force you to read this important message, make you click OK, and then you can go back to your graceful database experience." Use modal dialogs when it's critical to get the user's attention. Reserve alerts for actionable information, not advisory messages. And go modal for self-contained tasks that must be completed start to finish, keeping those tasks simple, short, and narrowly focused with an obvious way to exit. I'd say if you're going to be bold enough to interrupt the user's experience, you should have a good reason, something that requires an advanced style dialog window. The extra work to set it up will make you think twice about doing it. When you replace modal dialogs with status messages that appear on the layout, make them obvious and prominent. Put them where you think the user will be looking. Use a consistent icon for the situation, like an arrow icon, or use a special color. Here's group 3, what the user sees. Communication. Reading takes extra mental effort. I confess, I love to write. I have been known to put paragraphs of detailed instructions on layouts and to talk a lot when I give presentations, but I've come to understand that people never read all that carefully crafted text because it's hard for them. It's hard for all of us. Just looking at it makes you feel tired. And that's because we're wired for language, but not for reading. We've had spoken language forever, but language reading didn't become common until like 500 years ago. Not everybody reads well, and even for skilled readers, it takes much more effort and attention to process written words than it does to process images on the screen. So use the least text possible. When you do use text, consider your user's vocabulary. Avoid jargon and technical terms unless appropriate, and use simple, direct language. Layout. Guide the eye to what's important. A good visual hierarchy will make your layout much easier for the eye to scan. Field and label placement also makes a big difference. Other layout recommendations include use 1 or 2 fonts throughout the solution. I think you heard that recently. Use ample size and spacing, and minimize scrolling and zooming, especially on iOS, where the temptation is greatest. Color, when used effectively, enhances communication. FileMaker's layout themes have set up some harmonious color families for you. I like to create a palette in the color picker and copy all the theme colors there. This makes them available in Photoshop and other graphic design applications. This is what the iOS 7 color family looks like. It's got vibrant colors and good contrast. And that's important because our vision is optimized for contrast, not brightness. To test contrast, try viewing your interface in grayscale, no color. Can you distinguish interactive, non-interactive, and background elements one from another? You can also try the squint test. Just squint at the screen and see what stands out for you. So that was group 3, what the user sees. I talked about communication, labels, and visuals. I'm fascinated by the physiological and psychological reasons behind graphic design rules. I hope you found them interesting too. And here's the last group. We're in the home stretch. What the user needs. Accessibility. Share your solution with the most people possible and focus first on ease of use. Plan for color blindness. I confess that back when I was working at UCSF, a doctor and I worked together to create a scheduling system for the operating room. Our color coding looked something like this. It indicated the relative availability of people for a specific shift, green being the best choice and dark gray not being an option at all. And it worked just fine until that doctor turned the system over to someone who was colorblind. This is how the interface looked to him. By the way, I'm using Color Oracle to simulate this. It's a free application that you can download for Mac, Windows, or Linux. Fortunately, we had set a numeric calculation to drive the conditional formatting, so it was easy to put the numbers directly on the screen, like this, making the colors less overwhelming and still interpretable by the new doctor. You can see that I've added a translucent circle to improve the contrast between the number and the patch of color. This is a great example of how constraints actually can improve a design by making you look at it differently. Performance. Poor performance makes your system untrustworthy. Feedback can go a long way towards making your solution seem more performative. People are likely to tolerate a long process if they get regular updates on how it's doing. For operations that last more than a few seconds, provide a progress indicator to help users judge how long lengthy operations will take. Be sure to give them the option to cancel if they don't like the answer. You don't want your progress indicator to take up much processing time. There's a certain irony when you end up slowing down a process to give the user an idea of how long it's going to take. But progress indicators don't have to consume lots of resources. Here are some good options. Float a window on top that says, processing, please wait, and close the window when the process is done. Include variables in that window and update them periodically, maybe with text describing each step of the process or with a batched count of the records being processed. Use a web viewer to display a dynamic progress bar image. This is a super awesome one from Tim Simbura. There are other good ones out there too. Or use the new base64 function to generate a dynamic progress bar stored in a calculated container field. Now let's talk about performance itself. Find out which tables are going to get big, and make sure you design and test your processes to ensure they can handle the data load. Evaluate the performance of your solution in general, testing it in all environments with test data before launch and also periodically during the life of your solution, because nothing ruins a beautiful solution faster than adding that pesky user data. Consider distributing the load by finishing tasks in the background, either using the new perform script on server command, scheduled server-side scripts, or robot client machines. Some of this is harder to maintain. Server-side scripts are difficult to debug, and robots have to be monitored to make sure they stay online, but it can make your solution perform a lot more quickly. And this is the last of my 12 guideline topics, security, which is not about getting in the user's way, it's about shaping the user experience to mitigate risks. The ideal security model is invisible to the user. They don't know what they don't get. Make sure you leverage the FileMaker security model rather than substituting your own database security. You can lock things down the way FileMaker can, but supplement it with scripting so that the user experience is more graceful. Don't inflict the dreaded and inscrutable "your access privileges do not allow you to perform this action" upon your users. Instead, trap for this error and show your own dialogues, giving the user a clearer picture of what's gone wrong and what, if anything, they can do about it. Consider security requirements early in the development process and talk to experts when you can. That was group 4, what the user needs. It's too easy to overlook these important aspects of the user experience. Make sure they get equal time in your development process. So there you have it, a very selected exploration of Apple's human interface guidelines. My hope is that this talk has inspired you to read the guidelines for yourselves, if only to find out how much I made up. If you're like me, when you leave here, when you sit down to work and try to put these ideas into practice, you may find yourself feeling stuck or overwhelmed. The trick is to find a way to sneak past your resistance and allow yourself to be bad at it for a while. Remember, you need to practice as with any other skill. You need to work out. So try playing with low-pressure personal projects to develop fluency and confidence. And there's nothing wrong with asking for help. Find friends or colleagues to critique your work. Really, truly do that. Take classes from experts like Don Levan and Albert Haram Alvarez, and talk to folks here at DEF CON. Finally, read as much as you can, starting with Apple's guidelines and then moving on to all the classics. And question everything, asking why, and so what, and does this get my user closer to their goals? And these books are all the classics. If you haven't read them yet, you're in for a treat. Thank you.